Hey everyone, welcome back to Real Talk Podcast. Today we have a really fun episode. I am actually joined by my wife Kelly on the podcast because Lucas didn't want to be part of this conversation, which will become evident why fairly shortly. Maybe Kelly can introduce herself just a little bit, and then we can, introduce our guest.
Hi. So I'm Kelly. Tyler's wife. We've been married for almost 6 years. We have 2 little boys. One's about 2.5, and the other one is almost a year old. I'm a stay-at-home mom, and that's pretty much all I need to know about me.
But Kelly was a hairdresser, so she's good at lighthearted chit-chat.
Yeah.
So she'll just blend right into this podcast and fill Lucas's shoes. So so let's introduce our guest. We have Sara Hutten on today. Who wrote a wonderful book, Unmet Expectations. I was just going to read the cover of this, my new copy of this. Maybe I'll show the camera too in case people are like watching this. The subtitle, I guess, is Facing Unmet Expectations in the Pursuit of Children and Learning How to Better Prepare Those Ready to Walk This Journey. So we're talking about raising a family and how people go about starting a family and the journey that entails. So Sara, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit and
Sure.
Where you grew up and kind of your story up to starting to write the book.
Okay. So I'm Sara, and I've been married to John for 9 years now. And we have a son, and he's 5.5 now. I kind of grew up Dunnville, St. Catharines area, and we live in the Niagara region. So that's home. Niagara region is home.
Okay.
And I grew up in the Reformed church, and everything that comes with that. I don't know.
That's all right. That's the same with us. So
definitely background we're all familiar with. So,
Exactly.
A lot of people can relate to that.
that's good. Then you can speak into our community quite a bit. So that's good. So just maybe you can briefly outline the book and maybe just why you wanted to write it, and maybe some just general overarching the theme you're going for.
Yeah. So basically this book came out of mine and my husband's personal experience in pursuing children. So going from that desire for children to actively pursuing it. And the choice for the word pursuit is on purpose because it's a really active thing especially when it doesn't happen for you. And we faced, for us, it felt like we faced kind of a hit in a lot of different areas in this pursuit, from trying to conceive when we were pregnant and down through it feels like the history of these, wanting children. So having gone through something so pivotal in our life, and it was, so I'll speak just for myself. It was something my husband and I went through together, but in the book, also, I speak just from my own perspective as a Christian woman. But going through something that had changed me so drastically and was so pivotal in my life, I really wanted to remember it and remember what we had gone through, because it was it was part of my identity now.
Right,
so I started writing it down, and just a little side note, also, ever since I was a young girl, I've always wanted to write a book. So that desire to write was always there.
Right.
And it just came out in this because of these events. So I kind of started writing it out for myself. And as I started to write, it kind of came pouring out of me. And there were these themes that I could see coming out. And I started to feel this calling to, not just write for myself, but to hopefully write for the Christian community, and specifically to the women in that community. So that's kind of what brought the book about. Because a lot of people ask me that, why'd you write a book? I'm not an expert writer. I didn't even go to university for anything like that. Nor am I an expert in what I write about. It's just my experiences that are kind of behind why I wrote it. So the book itself is divided into 2 parts. So part 1 is mine and my husband's story. And it kind of goes in and out of what we were experiencing, and then back to the reader, how kind of what we learned and were learning along the way how that can help the reader come alongside someone else or challenge them in maybe their perceptions of, this longing for children and what's all involved in it. So it kind of does this in and out throughout our story, and that each chapter is a separate section of our story, whether that was our infertility or our pregnancy that was turned scary, the dramatic birth of our son. It just kind of feels like the hits kept coming. And then the second part is called The Other Perspective. And I reached out to 5 other people who I had also seen experience a different version of the story than we see more common.
Yeah.
And I said to them, hey, I'm writing this book. I'm talking about how we go into this hoping and kind of expecting a certain outcome, but God called us to something different. Do you feel like this is something that your story aligns with? And we were able to come out with 5 different perspectives, and those perspectives are written in their words. So I didn't interview them and write for them. They wrote it themselves, so it could be the truest version of their story, because they're such delicate stories.
Yeah.
It's just such a vulnerable part of your life, and to share it publicly it's a really tender thing. So that was definitely something new. Like, to maneuver that was challenging. So the 5 perspectives are the husband's perspective. So my husband is one of the writers there, and he actually zeroes in on the birth story of our son and how that was affecting him and his relationship with God, and how he was kind of questioning like what was happening and the things that he had kind of longed for through that. And then the other 4 perspectives there's a miscarriage perspective. There's one called the hyperemesis perspective. That one actually spans across
a few topics. Because she has a miscarriage in it too, right? Yeah. So
and they have infertility, and it also speaks on pregnancy after miscarriage.
Right.
And how that is its own journey.
Yeah. And that's a big movement too, pregnancy after loss. It's definitely becoming more talked about. And
and then there is the biological perspective. And that is someone who was never able to give birth to their own biological children, and some of the losses and some of the trials that come with that. And then the last perspective is kind of unique, that it doesn't share as much about what they physically went through. It's more of a focus on, so this person had secondary infertility, and now that they're living with this in a community that is where you're surrounded by families with children. What is that like? And there's never, at least in the 5 years since having our son, there's never been very many opportunities to kind of talk about what you're really feeling, especially with people who have kids, because you want to rejoice with them and what God has, brought to their life. But for this to be a space for there to be some honesty about the types of things that are hard, I was really excited for that perspective. So that's a very quick overview of what's in the book.
No, that's good. Yeah. So why did you write it for the Christian community in particular? And then, is it something that you think our churches need specifically? I think you talked to it a little bit, but is this something we need to improve on?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to write it, not only for the Reformed community, but more inclusively for spanning across all Christians.
Right.
Because even in some of our friends that aren't part of the Reformed churches, in sharing this message, they were excited, and they were eager to learn about it more as well. And I think so as Christian community, we are very good, and I'm so thankful that we're so good at hoping in the Lord and being joyful together and the good things that he brings us. But I think that sometimes there's this fear of not seeming thankful enough when we talk about the things that are hard. And that you don't need to pick one or the other. You can be thankful for where God is bringing you and for what someone else has been given. while also seeking that support and saying, hey, this is hard for me. This has been a challenge for us. We're really struggling through this. And as my friend or as our family, this is where we could use some support or some just extra thoughtfulness. And I think too, specific now to the community that I find myself in, it's a Dutch Reformed church. And there is a personality to our churches that is cultural to that Dutch immigrant personality.
Yep.
And that personality that was cultural has become the personality of our churches in some cases. And part of that is some stoicism. Things are kept very private, especially about a woman's body. Marriages are viewed as very sacred, as they should be. But I don't know that we have found the balance in viewing our marriages as sacred while also letting go of our privacy for the sake of seeking help. And I think those are some of the challenges that our church communities are facing as people are needing help in the areas of infertility and miscarriage and, desiring children in communities that are filled with children. It's just such a complex thing to try to maneuver.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about like our communities being like full of children like that. Because I mean, I guess like statistically, we have way more kids in our communities than other communities do. Yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, unless you have something else, we can jump into what is the unmet expectation of it all, and how does that I mean, that's what the title is, and I guess like that. There's a whole bunch that theme kind of works all the way through the book. So Kelly and I had a chance to read it, which was great, before it even hits the shelves. So very privileged, but maybe you can talk to that theme, like how it works through, but also like to like an unmarried couple or like a newly married couple who's looking like at the beginning of this pursuit for children. How does this this really affect them, or what advice do you have for them?
Yeah. I think if we want to look at let's look at 5 examples of where people were barren or had infertility, even in the Bible. 4 of those examples, they all end up having children later in the story. And that, especially when I was going through it, was something that was really hard to kind of swallow and accept, because without the Bible ever promising, or even God promising these things to us, I feel like there's this unspoken belief that those who are faithful will receive.
But it'll still happen eventually.
Yeah, if you really just believe, or right with Elizabeth and Zachariah, like there was this true belief that needed to happen, and there was this waiting that needed to happen. And
Hannah too. Like I just read it with my oldest during breakfast devotions today about Samuel, and it's like and Hannah prayed and she had a baby, and it's like, isn't that amazing? And it is amazing, but again, she did have Samuel,
and it's there's this, I don't know when it happens or how it happens. One of the biological perspective speaks on this as well, how it almost feels like children are promised in the Bible, but that's actually not a promise that God gives us. He tells us how he's honored by children, and, raising children in the fear of his name glorifies him.
And children are a blessing, like what Psalm 127. Right?
All of those things. And we've translated that, as we align it with what we want in our hearts for ourselves, as, okay, well, then this is something God's going to give us. Yeah. And he's given it to so many people that it's easy to kind of connect those dots, but God never made that connection.
No.
Yeah. Right.
So I think that's part of where, even the cover, the word expectations is surrounding unmet, because I feel like I surrounded myself. I did it to myself with, okay, so this is what happened for all the women in my life. That means it's going to happen for me.
Yeah.
But God never promised that to me.
No.
So I think that's where we fall into these expectations.
Right.
And I think for these young couples that are at the beginning of this journey, and this book is dedicated to those people. It's dedicated to the young women who are so excited. They just want to get married and have kids.
Especially if the women in their family never really seem to have a problem with it, right? It's like they look at their mom and their grandma, sisters, whoever.
Yeah.
And everyone just seems to have babies and it never seems to be a big deal. It's just like, oh, we're going to have a baby and it's all exciting. And
I think the key word there is seems, because I think it's the lack of even someone who has what we would say, not a difficult time. There were parts that were hard that aren't always shared. And I think it's that, coming across as it being easy when it maybe never really was. Because raising a child is really hard. And, carrying a child in your womb is really hard. And longing for those things when they're not happening is really hard. But so these young couples that are just about to start this journey, they have this desire and they're deciding, okay, let's pursue this. I think something that can keep them grounded, and I know I never did, and I, having gone through what we've gone through, can say this today. Like prayer is so powerful. And if we can really open our hearts to hear God's answer and just say, Lord, like, this is what we long for. And God even says in the Bible, we can remind him, of his character, and we can remind him of what he's taught us in scripture. You can say, Lord, you are honored by this. You're glorified by this, but please prepare us for what you have planned. Because there's so much that we can start to feel like we have control over that we don't have any control over. And especially if you go through infertility or fertility treatments, you realize just the intricacies of conception and how many things in your just environment of your body and your husband's body and
need to be aligned in order. I know.
And it's not us. It's not
the doctor saying like, now is the time. And no.
Yeah, it's a miracle anyway.
It's a miracle. And I think to be grounded in, being honest with God about what you want and asking for those things. Yes. But then also saying, prepare us for what you have. I think if a couple can honestly be on their knees asking for that and saying that to God, there will be even more joy and even more hope that we already, like I was saying, our community is so good at being joyful and hopeful. But if we don't expect it or we don't think that it's owed to us, that joy will just be exponential.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I wonder if it's like, we can get into like talking about like, there's a bit of a difference between how, say a newly married man thinks about a family and a newly married woman. Like, I think there's a lot of expectation on a woman's part a lot of time, like what you experienced was like, was like an expectation, but also like this hope and this joy and the excitement for that stage.
Yeah.
Well, and often it starts early, like we're in the church nursery, so you're surrounded by kids and then you do your own babysitting, right? So you're always thinking like, oh, like when I have my own kids, and
it's in our nature.
Yeah.
To nurture.
And even like for myself, like I would not, my friends would know this, like I'm not a baby person, but even as someone who didn't like to babysit, we're created that way.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because of how our bodies are created, when you're married, whether you're planning to not have children or planning to have children, there's something that physically needs to happen around children at all times, because it's what our bodies were created to be able to do.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And for men, it seems to be more like, I don't know, I like reading your husband's perspective too. He just barely touched on it, but it was more like, and I wanted 2 or 3 kids or 3 or 4 kids. Right. And that's kind of more like the way I felt, I think, going into like our marriage too, was like, yeah, I think this many kids is, that sounds like a fun family size.
It's probably about all the thought that went into it.
Yeah, it's not like, it's not like it comes from a nurturing place where you're like, but I can see myself caring for these kids, and like I've really like experienced the journey of it. Like that's not really, I don't know, it just seems to be a little bit different.
I think is almost kind of a shame, because when you choose as a couple to have children, you're having them together. You're raising them together. You're on that journey together. And as much as I can say, I wrote this book like for women, I think every chapter I wrote, I wanted to end with saying, this is for you too, you guys. Because
they also see us going through it too, right? And see how much we want something. And
and if you can understand what you're your wife's body is going to be going through, what her heart could possibly have to be handling along the way, in like talking about that preparation for young women. I think it's also for young men so they can support properly, and it affects you as well. Right? Like when things go difficult, that affected my husband's relationship with God. It affected his, he needed support. So as much as I did write it for women because I speak from a woman's perspective, this is a conversation that men need to be having together as well.
Well, and for sure having with like, as they head into their marriage, having it with their to be, fiance or their wife, or, and that whole openness of it. I'm curious how much of it is like, we don't talk about it much because we expect it to be, we on one hand expect it to be easy. Like we kind of expect kids to just show up. But on the other hand, we expect pregnancy to be difficult because we're told pregnancy is difficult and like there's pain in that. And so it's almost like, well, there's a certain amount of like, hardship you just have to swallow, and you can't like, how much of that like goes back to the community where we just like, well, you know what, like everyone's having a hard time. We're not sure how hard a time because no one's saying anything. Yeah. But we're just going to, let it be and, just make it happen. Like,
And I think that sense of, well, they maybe had it worse, or I don't have it as bad as that, so I'll just kind of suck it up. Yeah. I think that can be very damaging.
Right. Yeah.
And I talk about this concept of comparatively diminishing our own pain.
Oh yeah. I was going to bring that up.
And like, I just think that's so sad because just like, even for myself, like I definitely didn't have it the worst, not even near the worst. So I kind of question, who am I to be writing this story? But it's what God is using your experiences for. So if it's hard for you, it's hard for you. It doesn't matter how hard it is for somebody else. Seek out that help and that support. Even if someone else went through something more difficult and didn't, need any coping mechanisms and didn't reach out to, their church for prayer or meals, it doesn't mean you can't, because it's changing you in ways that'll be different from that person. And I think that's something to be really cautious of. It's, in all areas, but specific to like you talking about this pregnancy, the sucking it up, I think that's a choice people make. And I don't think it's something we need to be doing. If it's hard, get help and talk about it.
Yeah. I think maybe we can kind of roll through the, the first chapters. The first part of the book is about, your story. I don't know how much of the story you want to tell and how much you want people just to wait and read in the book. Yeah. But like, we're very interested in like the whole, basically it goes through like fertility and the pregnancy, and then the labor and, the difficulties with birth, and then, postpartum, basically like that whole period. And then, obviously your recovery. So maybe we can just start with like the fertility side of it. And I'm sure like we have lots of questions about like all sorts of stuff. Okay. I don't know how much of your story you want to share, or we can,
Do you want me to give like an overview?
Sure.
Sure.
What happened? Yeah.
So, we were about 6 months married when we decided that we wanted to try and start a family. And it wasn't happening for us. So even from the time that we decided we were ready to go to a fertility clinic, that readiness dissipated as soon as we started researching into it. So even after saying, okay, we know this is something that we need to do, I think it was another 1.5 years before that even happened, because there's a lot of different heart hurdles, and there's the loss of how you pictured things going that you have to kind of let go of before you're ready to take those next steps. And then, we went to fertility clinic. I'm thankful that even our treatment was pretty minimal. But no matter how minimal it was pretty invasive on our,
I was going to say, it's so much more invasive than what it like naturally is.
Yeah.
Right. So anything ends up being a hurdle and
and you
inconvenience almost.
You kind of question things. I'm sure every woman questions it differently. Like, I'm definitely not a spokesperson for people going through this kind of thing. But for me, it was saying out loud, why do I have to buy my baby? And that's a horrible thing to say because it's just not true. But these are like,
that's how you feel.
Yeah. And that's a really like kind of existential crisis to go through in wanting children. So you have to work through that, and you have to, even though no amount of money is, a problem if it's for a child, you still have to make wise financial decisions, and you need to. There's just so many ducks that you need to put in a row.
Yeah.
It's not something you think about before you go into it. Like,
No.
yeah, it definitely takes. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, even as so then we finally got through those doors, and like, sorry, do you want me to like give it an idea of like what fertility treatments are like, or just an overview of like our story?
Well, yeah, no, like I think people like.
Well,
no one really thinks
there's a bunch
about,
of fertility treatments anyways, right? So
yeah, and there's some that like, I mean, you've obviously had a certain experience or a certain set of treatments or whatever. But then like there's obviously like other ones that people are, pursue, and some people don't pursue because they're, ethically questionable.
Right.
I think you like briefly touched on it.
I very briefly touch on that.
But I mean, it's hard. That's a whole other conversation. But I mean, maybe you can like outline for people, in a way that you're comfortable with anyways, like just what somebody would be in for with that.
Yeah.
Like, so I don't know, maybe we can share our story a little bit too, but it's like, I mean, it's not like fun.
It's, like we said, it's pretty intrusive. But when you go, there's certain levels of treatment, and each one becomes more invasive. Some might even say like more artificial. But when you go right away, they're going to kind of test your like environment, your fertile environment. They're going to do blood work, and they're going to do urine samples. And for the male, you're going to have to give a sample. And they're
like
going
to check your tubes and
check if your fallopian tubes are open and everything like that. So it just gives them a baseline of what they're working with and what treatment you're going to need. So the first level of treatment is just timed intercourse, which is treatment you can do at home, but they can also assist you in the fertility clinic, really monitoring like the growth of follicles and where your hormones are surging or dipping, or giving you extra medication along the way.
And that's
which means blood work every time you go in then, right? To test those hormones. So that's another added intrusion. And for some people, needle phobia is a real thing. And they're going to do blood work every time.
Yeah.
So.
And when you go, like, it's all based on like when your cycle starts and stuff. So when you go, you go once, and then it's every 3 or 4 days, and then it's every other day, and then it's every day. Yeah. And like you might be going every day for a week, depending on what's your environment is like. So
early in the morning.
And for us, it was, okay, I'm going to go before, my husband leaves for work, and you're leaving the house at 5:30. Like the blood in your veins isn't even moving yet by the time you're getting your blood taken. So I know for myself, they said, okay, you need to run up 3 flights of stairs before we do your blood work.
I didn't have that. And we live close to the clinic, so we weren't 45 minutes away. But I would have gotten up really early.
It's really early. And every time it would be like, I don't want to go. And my husband would say, you don't have to go. And I would just give him a kiss, and I would just leave, because not going meant something too big to accept.
Yeah. And it could be like a whole month of loss of work that you've done already. Yeah.
And thankfully, like even funding has changed from when we started, but it used to be you paid to, monitor a cycle. And that was every month. But now that fee actually covers a whole year. So thankfully the government has acknowledged some need in that area. So that's super helpful for some couples. But so that's pretty intrusive. And also every time they do blood work, they're doing an internal ultrasound. So that that can have long-term effects on you, and it's very intrusive. Yeah. It's not fun.
Yeah, it's not fun.
No. So so it starts timed intercourse. One of the next treatment levels would then be intrauterine insemination, which is where they'll the husband will give a sample, they'll wash the sperm, and then they'll place the sperm in the uterus when there's a mature egg that's ready to be fertilized. And at least in Canada, that can cost anywhere between like $2,000 and $4,000 just to do that one time.
I've never researched the cost of that.
Yeah. It's
it jumps up so high from regular just blood work and stuff like that.
And maybe for some people, it seems kind of crazy to even talk about how much something like that costs, because it's for life. But that is a huge factor in, can we do another cycle? Like, can we actually physically afford this?
I know.
Right, and I think...
And a month goes by pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think...
It's like,
times that by 12.
Yeah.
Like seriously. And a
Yeah.
year isn't even that long to be trying. And if you're going to do that every month, like
Yeah.
that is physically, mentally exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like on the financial side, I think that I don't talk about this in the book, but I think that kind of is a window of opportunity, like especially as a community that really does value building your family.
Mm-hmm.
That
I
could
never
be
thought of that, actually,
a
yeah.
place for even like reaching out to your deacons and saying, hey, this is what we're going through. But when those ethics come into play, it just complicates everything.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that would be the next level of treatment, is called IUI. And then after that is IVF, which is in vitro fertilization.
And I feel that most people are familiar with that.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like IVF is definitely
Yeah.
initial
So,
that people
but
are familiar with.
even in the realm, like the first step is like it. I know you said in the book too, it takes the fun out of your marriage, basically.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and so like, I don't know, we can maybe you want to tell our story just a little bit. Like, I don't know, just
I would
just
love
like
to hear it.
just briefly. Anyways, like I don't know how, I can't remember all the dates and the times and things like that, but
Yeah. Fortunately for us, we only did this 2 months before we got pregnant with our first. So
Right,
we were
like,
probably
married for
married
what, like-
probably for a good year before I went to our family doctor and just saying that like, yeah, like we were trying to have a baby and it wasn't happening yet. So she took the conservative route, which I was very thankful for because I think a lot of doctors often jump up to like IUI, like IVF. But she's like, no, we're just going to go to, she's like, I know a clinic who's
it's a
like,
Dunville or a doctor in Dunville. So they're like
Okay.
conservative doctor.
Right.
yeah, she's just a little hesitant to do things to just like jump the gun, which I
Right.
very much appreciated.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we got an appointment at a clinic in Hamilton and they did blood work and stuff like that. And then
Well, you do your initial appointment, which is not great, but I mean, it seems like more of a doctor's appointment kind of style. Like you're almost getting like a physical
Yep.
to start, which
Yeah.
is like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's
They're trying to
uncomfortable
get
and it's
that,
not fun.
baseline of
yeah.
But yeah,
so
you're
then
working
like
with a
yeah,
doctor,
then-
so it's like, okay, I guess we'll do this, right?
And then you and I got tested and like
Mhm.
my tubes were cleared and yeah, we were basically left with like no
They're like, there isn't a
diagnosis. There
problem.
wasn't really a problem. So we're
Mhm.
like, okay. So then we did do some like follicle stimulating hormones and stuff, and then a couple injections around time of ovulation. And yeah, and they monitor your follicles, probably very similar to
Yeah.
what you did.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah,
we
it was
had
a
said
few-
after the first month that if it didn't happen, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did the first
But,
month,
yeah.
and we were going through the course of the second. If it wasn't going to happen after that, then we were just going to kind of lay it low for the summer and just maybe pick it up again a few months later.
Mhm.
It was, and then you got pregnant. But it was, I remember being at a point where we were frustrated with it. Like, it was just like, it did take the fun out of your marriage. It was like,
oh yeah,
Now
time
you
in.
have-
It's like
Consumes
okay,
all of your thought and like even
Yeah.
like your time where you're actually talking with each other. It's all about that.
oh, it's, and it's,
I know. And say you had a really tiring day or something like that
Yeah.
at work, and normally you kiss your goodnight and go to
Just
sleep.
good night.
It's
Well,
like,
no, now this is the evening that we actually need to do this.
Yeah,
Mm.
and this is like 1 out of 3 in a row 3 nights in a row that
Yep.
you have to have intercourse,
Mhm.
and it really does take
Yeah.
the fun out of it.
And
Mm.
I think that like that is such a hurdle because so you're married and you're like, hey, let's have kids or whatever. Your romantic life looks a certain way, and you can't expect it not to change. Like it will
Mhm.
change. And I think to be able to find other ways to have those romantic moments together,
Mhm.
Mhm.
dinner out, like being really intentional with your time together,
Mm.
I think can be very helpful because
it's
it's just the pits. Like
Yeah.
it's
It's just
really
not
no fun.
it's just not something that some people prepare you for, though, right? Like you go to the doctor and they're doing the medical stuff, but they're not preparing you for the relational
Yeah.
issues, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think like your book is great because like you get a glimpse into somebody else's, experience with it, and then you can say, oh, okay, well, she like reflecting on it. Sarah said, well, like this is kind of what I was thinking. You're like, oh, maybe we should like talk about it and being intentional with our like
marriage
bringing
prep.
bringing
marriage.
romance into our marriage or whatever
Yeah.
we need to do.
Yeah.
Because it does, like, as soon as you make the decision, which, you spoke to, like, it's a hurdle to get over
Yeah.
the fact that you might need help with this
Mhm.
medically,
And then
and
to
then-
also have to face the effects of that decision once you get to
Yeah.
that decision.
Mhm.
but you don't know what the effects are.
You don't know until you
you're
live
like,
it.
I guess
right?
we just do it. And then you,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, aside from even having resources to, share with people in our community that like, this is where you could go, because like we had to do all our own research, because like, it's not something you just like, hey, so did you guys have this problem?
Did you go to a fertility
Where did you
clinic?
go?
How did you conceive your child?
Yeah,
Like,
it's
you're
not
not going to go ask
It's not like
somebody
what
that.
hospital was your kid born in. It's like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But you almost start thinking of like the couples that say they didn't have a kid for like 5-6 years, and they almost start looking at them a little differently, like definitely more compassion, be like, they might have gone through the same thing that we have gone through. And if only you had known then.
Yeah. And I think that's where this, like the introduction really touches on this. I feel like there's this need to prepare our young couples in a fuller way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes from, we need to be sharing our stories. More willingly. Like, not everyone is gonna be called to that. And who you share it with is like, it's your close people. It's the cousin in your life. It's the sister-in-law. Right. It's those people. Because when you share those stories, then let's say a couple's going through it, like you're saying, they already know who to go to and who to say, okay, they shared, one time we were at their house for coffee, and like it came up, right? That this was part of their journey. And I know as a community, testimonials like aren't really, at least in my experience, aren't really a big thing. And I think that's where even like in an interpersonal way, sharing our testimonies and sharing those big things in our life can be so helpful.
Yeah. You almost need like couples who a minister would know, so that when he is bringing another couple through marriage preparation counseling, then we can be like, well, you know what? Like, I actually know of a couple who went through this, and I would like to bring them in to talk to you about that. And then at least then they would have like a real life couple, that not just hearsay from a minister. Yeah.
And like, I think that's the hope with like our model of home visits and having our elders come into our home and to be able to share our lives. I think if that can be utilized in a way that connects, a family who's struggling with something with a family who's come out the other side. They're going to, have their own scars from that. They don't have to have done it well or even perfectly or even well, but they've gone through it. And I think those connections being made from like a middle person, even if you're sharing with a friend what you're going through, for them to be able to, even in confidentiality, reach out and say, hey, I have someone in my life who's going through this. I know you've gone through it too. Can I connect the two of you? I think that can be really powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Helpful. Well, I mean, it's hopefully you wrote a book, so now everyone who listens to this is just going to call you. So they're going to like get your number.
But the book is, calling everyone who is comfortable enough to share, because it won't be everybody, but
and it would have to be every story. Detail. Even just the fact like I went through it too. And,
and even to like the women who might not think, I don't relate to this kind of struggle with having children. There's something that's been hard in your journey to children. Whether if it wasn't conceiving, maybe pregnancy was really challenging for you. Just share those stories. It's not, I think there's a fear of, complaining about what we've gone through, but that's not what it needs to be. It can be a sharing how we can say God was so good and God provided. But he provided in, me having this sister-in-law who was, such a blessing and a support to me. Show those specifics on how he provided.
Yeah, right.
I think some people also take their bad experiences and kind of wear them as a badge of honor and be like, well, I went through this. Yeah. And it's like, no, you don't have to be proud of it. No. You probably should have reached out for a bit of help, because
you don't have to do it on your
something
own.
that you have to do on your own. Yeah.
And that's not how God created our community either, right? It's that body. It's that, the hand needs the foot. And
yeah, exactly. We're all meant to help each other. And
yeah, exactly.
But even as I say that, I know there were parts in our journey. So moving out of the infertility, and thankfully we were able to get pregnant, and but at our anatomical ultrasound, they realized that my body was already going into labor. So I was put on bed rest.
How many weeks is that for?
20 weeks. Okay. So, but my reaction to that was I was losing complete control of the whole situation, that I wanted to control something. And that only thing I can control was who was getting this information. So I like completely closed the shutters and like closed the doors. And I said to family, I said, you're not allowed to tell anybody about this, which really was me asking them, well, you now need to support me on your own.
Right.
Like I didn't realize that's what I was saying, but that's kind of how it played out.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually it was, oh, well, Sara hasn't actually been in church for a while, but John is. And then people start reaching out, like, is everything okay? And
Yeah, right.
And then it kind of was this like nudge to then kind of open up. Meanwhile, that could have been weeks of my church family being in prayer for us and for the safety of our baby and all these things that I wasn't willing to let go of my quote unquote privacy for the sake of the body being able to function the way it was intended to.
It's not something like, you know, if you think about.
No.
Like not something that dawns on you while you make that decision.
Oh, when you're in it, you're just like, this is my stuff. Yeah. Like, don't you tell anybody. And you're just reacting.
Yeah.
You're not.
And you think like, why on earth would they need to know this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like how much of it was that and how much of it was like, you know, you just want to get through it so you can say you got through it, or like the struggle, like personally, or like, it's just everything.
I think it was just not even knowing how to cope. Right. We had lost a sense of control with the infertility, but having gotten pregnant fairly quickly through that process, it was like we forgot everything we had learned. You just are like, oh, okay, now we can control it.
Yeah.
Oh, now we've got
everything's back to normal. Yeah. Now it's back.
Oh, now it's my turn to now enjoy this. And you know, God was there to remind me, well, actually, this is, you know, all in my plan. And yeah, so even though.
It's good.
That's a complete thought.
I mean, pregnancy and the struggles that come with it. I mean, I can't imagine that. Like even a good pregnancy is hard. So, yeah, like maybe you can share a little bit about like your story with, you know, being on bed rest and then, you know, I guess even going into early delivery and, you know, that whole, you know, thing.
So I was on bed rest for 10 weeks and up until that 20 week where they put me on bed rest, my pregnancy was fairly quote unquote normal. I was working. I actually left my job to go get the ultrasound done and I was going back because it was flowers. So it was seasonal and it was like, get this done and just go back to work. But I literally left the ultrasound and they said, oh, yeah, go to your family doctor. She's waiting for you. When does your doctor just go see you after you've been at the hospital? So I knew things had to be pretty serious. And yeah, so I was put on bed rest at home, thankfully. And they said, the only reason you're home is because you don't have other kids at home that you're going to be tempted to be picking up. But yeah, I needed to stay horizontal because my body was ready to be giving birth. So thankfully God allowed our son to continue to grow for another 10 weeks. And the evening that he was born, I had been kind of in pain throughout the day, the same kind of pain I would get if I maybe did a few too many things. Like, so this bed rest was, you can get up and make yourself a sandwich and you can shower once a week, but like you lay down otherwise. And
that's so dark.
I know, I'm just saying, it's like
during that time, things like you said, did you say that's really dark?
It's hard. It's like, it's dark. It's just hard. Everything.
And that's exactly how it became for me. Like already not realizing this at the time, but being susceptible to like dark thoughts, you know, depression, anxiety, things like that. That started to close in. And I did a number of things on my bed rest, from, you know, watching movies to reading books, to being on Pinterest. But the one thing I didn't do was open my Bible. And I'm so ashamed of that because that's probably it is exactly what I needed. And they were just very long days. And, you know, some days it would be me, you know, making a phone call. Hey, like, if you're free, like, do you want to come for coffee? Them coming for coffee was, well, you're making the coffee and you're bringing the stuff because I'm just laying here. But, you know, I would kind of brush it off as like, I'm really bored.
Visit. Yeah.
But meanwhile, I was, you know, grasping at survival just in terms of trying to get through the day. And, you know, we got to a point where we had to reach out to like my husband's boss. Is the last thing I wanted him to do. And just say, hey, like, in terms of Sara's mental health, like, it's not good right now. And she doesn't always feel safe at home. And that's a really hard thing to say out loud and admit. But to be able to be transparent with his boss in order that he could have those days when I needed him home because things just seemed way too hard was such a provision. And like, so he has a Christian boss, and it like God provided through that. And there were days where I could say, I need you today, but because they were being so considerate to our situation, it then also gave me the push to say, no, like I can do this today. Right. And just knowing he could come if I needed him. So that really speaks to like the communication that's needed between couples with your mental health in any issue, but specific to this, because this journey of having kids, it's as much as it's the woman's body going through it, you're going through it together. And when you can't sustain, stuff around the house, or you can't, be emotionally supporting what's going on, then he can. And there's this team aspect that's going on. So that was kind of how things, that's where things were turning on our journey. And so then as we got nearing the end of that 10 weeks, which we were so thankful to get to the 24 weeks, because 24 weeks is kind of the medically accepted time when they'll
considered viable then.
Viable pregnancy. Yeah. So every week it was just another answer to prayer. So the night that Logan was born, I was just in a lot of pain. So I was just resting a lot. And by whatever time, I realized that this pain was coming in waves. So we called the hospital and we said, hey, this is our situation. I'm not due for another 10 weeks. So why? But we also knew that I was in preterm labor. So she said, oh, you don't need to come. It's okay. Like, do whatever you want to do. And then I realized, this is coming in waves. So we ended up going to the hospital, and the whole way there, I'm like, John, I'm the woman who cried wolf. Turn around. And I was getting really angry. Like I was just really frustrated with the situation. I felt like such an inconvenience. And it was kind of one of those crossroads where, like our freedom of choice and like God's plan, it kind of felt like, what if we had decided? That's one of those moments in our life where what if we hadn't gone to the hospital? But God brought us there. Yeah. And within half an hour of getting to the hospital, my placenta had completely abrupted. So there's ruptured and there's abrupted. But basically what happened to me was the placenta just left.
Just pulled away from the uterus.
Yeah. And just completely left and released itself. So our son no longer like had a way to breathe. Within seconds I had passed out. But which is so crazy, because when we got to the hospital, they said, you're having the baby tonight. We're going to transfer you to Mac. The doctor said, I'm going to do a C-section and I'll come back and check you and then we'll send you over. But with even 15 minutes of him saying that this happened, and it turns out the reason he was born wasn't even related to what was going on with bed rest. It was a completely different issue. And I obviously wasn't conscious for the birth of our son. And so basically as they were wheeling me, John's just following. And I remember the nurse had to come up on the stretcher with me and everything. Anyways, they went behind the doors for an emergency C-section. And they basically said to him, you stop here.
I still can't believe they said that. It's like, is that normal?
Well, normally, if you have a C-section, the husband can go in.
He's in there.
Yeah. But I think it was the emergent state of it, because when the doctor came out, the first thing he said to John was, your wife is alive.
Yeah.
Your son is alive. I didn't actually know that until even writing he was writing his perspective and he was sharing it with me, because
the first words that the doctor said.
Yeah. It was kind of pivotal, right? Because neither of us knew really how serious.
Yeah.
What was going on. Well, I was unconscious, obviously I didn't know. But so that's kind of how our son came into the world. And I didn't see him for the 9 hours until I got to meet him. But it was not what we were expecting.
No, yeah, for sure.
And it just felt like, okay, it almost felt like we had this checklist in front of us. Okay, so trying to conceive. Okay, well, that didn't go according to plan. Pregnancy. Okay, well, that was not quite what we had expected.
You figure like we should now have a normal birth because we had everything else going against us.
And it's just it just took us we just kept thinking like what is going on here? And it's so odd to think that I was like that 13-year-old girl. I was like, oh, I just want to get married and I want to have the kids, like just classic. But I've gone through that. I've gotten pregnant. I've given birth. But when women share their stories, I can't relate. It's gives me kind of a weird out-of-body experience feeling. There's definitely, if anyone starts to share their birth story, if I'm able, like I like leave the room. Or I actually physically one time, a bunch of ladies, we were out for dessert and people just started sharing their stories because it's something you all have in common, or if you're all mothers. And I found myself all of a sudden physically turning away from the conversation before I even realized what was happening. And it was like, it just shows how there's this book called Your Body Keeps Score. And like, you can just never forget those kinds of experiences. So but that was our story.
Yeah. It's like,
so you almost have way more of a birth story than I do though. Seriously. Like definitely more exciting.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's terrifying and it's overwhelming and it's everything. Yeah.
But then it goes to show again, like how many things, like even that happening was in God's control. But for these normal birth stories, it shows how many things need to be happening at one time and timed perfectly, and like how it is so miraculous for us to even have children at all.
Well, so what kind of advice would you give for husbands? Because I'm thinking like the wife is just things just happen to you, right? It was just like, okay, then this happened, and then we just kind of try to deal with it. But are
you talking about giving birth or
everything, like from all the way from like the pregnancy, like say after infertility, like say you've gotten pregnant, like how can the husband best support like even a wife with like morning sickness or like, it's one thing just say, oh yeah, just be there for her. But it's another thing like to actually
have concrete plans.
Well, like you're on bed rest and it's just something that you just don't expect like your wife
to have to do.
It's
just support.
And you might not expect your husband to have to support you or even want it. Like honestly,
I think one of the best things that a husband can do to support his wife is to get support himself. Like he's walking on like new ground as well. And he doesn't know what's going on as much as I'm saying that we need to be sharing our stories. Men need to be coming alongside each other. It's so often the way we speak about having kids and it's so hard on the woman, like the man is going through this as well. And there's so much that they're just figuring out along the way. And John speaks about that in the husband's perspective. And he didn't realize that he needed it at the time, but he just had men who so would have been there if he had said, hey, I need you here. I need just to talk. I need someone just to be sitting even with me, or I need to tell someone what's going on because I don't know what to do next. For people to be able to reach in and say, how can I support you? And to reach out and say to a brother or a friend, okay, man, like we need to have a beer. We need to talk. Like, I think men need support. I think women are obviously more verbal naturally. So I think we reach out for that across the board for all sorts of areas. But I think when it comes to having kids, just talking to even another dad and saying, okay, my wife's having a really hard time with this. And it takes us as women being able to let go of someone else maybe knowing what's going on to us for him to find that support. But then you might find tools and tips from somebody else.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's part of it. It's like you're proud of your wife for what she's going through, but you also don't want to like, unnecessarily like expose that whole situation to anybody.
Yeah.
When you really don't know if like
they're going to be helpful or something.
Or your wife is going to want you to.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, that's
And
where
I
the
guess
communication between husband and wife comes in.
And I think that's where something like I was talking about, like that our marriages are sacred, and but somehow that has translated into keeping everything about them private.
Mhm.
And that I don't know where that translation happens, because we don't need to be figuring these things out and dealing with them in our little vacuums.
Yeah.
Because we've never experienced them before.
No.
But how many examples do we have of marriages, that have lasted through the decades that are surrounding us? Like, that is a gold mine of wisdom. And I think if we can let go of some of the privacy, the quote unquote privacy, together you have to be okay with sharing those details for the sake of somebody else. Like, I'll always remember my brother-in-law said to me, how did he say it? I don't care who knows about my sins or my shortcomings. If God can use it for his kingdom, then
I'm going to share it.
Then I'm going to share it.
yeah.
I feel like that was so helpful for me to just let go of what my shortcomings are, or what I felt like had happened to me. Because if God can use our story to help somebody else, isn't that the whole point? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's not just having like one person who's had a story like yours, like, and then you lay it out in such a formal way. It's like everybody who even has a little story, like just sharing it, because it does, like, you don't know who it's going to help, right?
Yeah.
And I think in sharing it, often you find that there's so many more people who've had the same thing as you've had to, and it just takes one person to break the dam, and then before you know it, then just more and more.
And that's the thing is, like, even this idea of fertility, like, it seems more common now, but I don't know that it's necessarily even more common. It's just more talked about, and I think treatment is more accepted, and treatment's actually even just more helpful nowadays because of medical advancements. But I think, there was, you trying to conceive a child, that's a very private thing. And it is, like, if you don't need to talk about it, why would anyone, I don't know, really choose to do that so openly? But I think if you can talk about where it's been hard for you, there's so many people.
Yeah.
That's one thing I don't know people realize. Like, I find it's becoming more prevalent, like, or maybe that's just because we're the age we are, or like, but it seems like every time you turn around, it's somebody that, is like, oh, like, you must be struggling. Like, and you kind of want to help. I don't know how to help, but it's,
fertility, it is genetic. So they say that if you're wondering, let's say you're about to start trying to have kids and you're curious, I wonder if I'm going to have trouble having kids, or you can kind of look to your blood relatives, like parents, uncles, aunts, whatever. I don't know how that is crossed with like gender or not, but that'll give you a sense of, so let's say your mother wasn't, had a hard time having kids. It might be something for you to kind of expect for yourself.
Right.
But it's not even necessarily, though, passed down either. So they say it's genetic, but.
And again, going back to our churches, we look at our big Dutch families, right? And then you just kind of assume again that it's like not going to be an issue.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what was it like to have a preemie? Like, that's something that people, I think, well, there are a certain amount of people who go through that regardless of everything before and after, right? Like, is that, maybe just speak to your experience and then like.
It's challenging. You want to be home with your baby. You want things to be normal again. And there's just so much you learn while you're in the hospital. So, as much as they're taking care of your baby, they're educating you at the same time. And thankfully, a lot of them are really willing to educate you, because then you can help. You're there all the time. And even like something small, like every time you go, like you want to touch your baby, and you just, because sometimes they're in an incubator when you're not allowed to touch them very often. And that's really challenging. You have this new baby and
hold their finger.
And then I remember getting in trouble for like touching my baby. And I was like, I excuse me, like this is my child. But then, like started to teach me, well, actually our job is to protect their quiet awake time. Because the more restful they are, the more they sleep, the more they grow. And the more restful their awake time is. So if they're being handled and kind of bugged a little bit, their heart rate's going to go up. That's not going to be time where they're growing. That's going to be time where they're
just coping,
using up. Yeah.
Right.
So just small things like that. And I mean, depending on where you live and what hospital your baby's in, like even as you're healing from giving birth or from whatever your journey was to have your baby, are you driving to and from the hospital constantly? Are you even getting enough rest at night? Are you sleeping there on like a cot? Like there's just so many things that are affecting you personally, and you're just zeroed in on your baby and you're kind of surviving. But I did hear someone recently, like who their children, anytime they have had a child, they know that they're in the NICU.
Oh, okay.
And they're saying how now that they know that that's what is coming, you kind of prepare yourself. And it's a lot easier when you know it's coming. It's still challenging. But I think it's when it catches you off guard that,
Yeah, for sure. So, and there's so many ups and downs with preemies too, right? Just like daily, there's like depending on their oxygen and I don't know. I've never had a baby, so it's like
you're on the right track. Yeah. There's so much that you're learning about, the proper respiratory rates. You're learning about the proper heart rate. You're learning about all these numbers, and you're looking at your baby through the lens of numbers. And even when it comes time to take your baby home, that's actually something they make you do is you have to stay overnight. Especially if it's your first. I don't know if you have more kids at home, they might not make you do this, but they make you stay overnight without the monitors on. And you are the one that takes care of your baby in the hospital that night because you've literally been caring for them through the numbers. The numbers have told you what they needed.
And they're very reassuring, right? When you see certain numbers, it's like, you don't
learn to read your baby's face or their voice or how they're reacting. You read the numbers. So that's really hard because even when we had him home, we didn't have the screen to tell us that he was okay.
Right.
And it's kind of an odd thing to then settle into learning your baby from square one because you've been around your baby for so long already. But when they come home with you, that's your day one, right? Like that's your
that's your first
time together.
Yeah.
There's this really odd divide between like your rights as a parent when your baby's in the hospital as well. So when your child's admitted, like let's say you were to take your baby out of the hospital before they said he was well enough, like that would be, you'd probably get charged with neglect for that. So there is this sense that the hospital knows best, which they really do. They know what's going on. But even, so we spent a time in the children's hospital and then in our home hospital.
Right.
And even in the home hospital, like we could hold our baby, but they didn't want us carrying him like around the halls because it's just not safe. But only grandparents were allowed in the area that we were in. So this is like pre-COVID era.
I was gonna say,
so that's a whole. I've talked to a few people who've had babies in the NICU and special care nurseries through COVID, and it's really such a shame that they are not able to be getting the supports that they need because it's such a challenging time. That's an entirely different conversation, but so even like we wanted to, or some of the closest people in our life obviously like aren't only the grandparents. We wanted to introduce our son. He was already 10 weeks old and all these things. And we weren't allowed to take him outside the doors. Like we weren't legally allowed. So there's this really weird divide with what you're allowed to do, but they are your child and it's kind of yes, but not yet. Yeah. Kind of feeling.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like when I was reading through that part of it, like it seemed like their birthday wasn't their birthday and like that they're like, you didn't own them or like you didn't own your son. It was like, it's this funny, weird it's very hard. Like, very hard to understand. Like, I mean, I guess you understand what's happening like with the healthcare and obviously you don't know best. And like, I mean, even if you think you're like, oh, like, I think he needs this, but but the numbers are telling us this. So, you know what, just stay out of it. Yeah. Like, I don't even when you're saying that, like, I'm thinking like when we had both of our kids, like you're trying to learn them the night, or I guess they were both born at night or heading into the night. That they were both like, you're spending a night learning them. Like you're trying to like learn their facial expressions and like just the timeline for you with having, Logan in like such intensive care, having all those like dates kind of not line up to be the same day just seems to me like it's just this funny thing we can't relate to. So like
it's a struggle, but there's so many families even in our like local communities that go through it.
Yeah.
And it's actually awesome how many people actually who've gone through it will reach out and say like, hey, how's it going? Like, and then to have the opportunity now down the road for me to do the same.
Yeah.
It really connects you because you can understand each other in a way that, not everybody can.
I guess then like having the kid brings it all into the open, right? Like what's happened. Like it's not like it's something that's secretive anymore.
Yeah. You've had your baby.
I know. I think like, I mean, we're not going to talk about this extensively, but like with miscarriage too, it's like something that like now it usually becomes public very quickly. Then it's almost like just the fact of not necessarily, but maybe with like longer or like later term, but like the support seems to be there. If people know, then it's like, as soon as the event occurs, then people are like, I went through that. I'm going to like help. Right. But then like, it just brings me back to all the other little things like the infertility and the pregnancy. And
but it's just more socially acceptable to talk about like a miscarriage or time in the NICU as opposed to trying to get pregnant. It's just, right. It's just the nature of the topics.
It doesn't get announced off the pulpit when you're,
going through fertility.
And
like, I'm so thankful even in this past year, I feel like even in our own local church, there's been more examples of specifically praying for couples that have gone through miscarriage and praying for the child that was lost by name. And I think it's just such a beautiful way for the church community to be able to come alongside these families.
Yeah. And if they have like a visitation or a funeral too, then it's just a really good way for everyone to come together.
And I've been really thankful to see that and then for those families to get that support. But I think the challenge that you're talking about with infertility is with miscarriage, you're mourning the loss of a child. With infertility, you're mourning the loss of something that never was.
Yeah.
So it's
true.
more it's tangible versus intangible. And you don't know what God will hold in the future. And as people will find out later in our book, we went back to try to have another baby, but eventually we had to decide not to pursue biological children anymore. And there's so often that I kind of, I told the close people in our life, but I kind of wished even like at Ladies Bible Study to just share this big decision that we had made. But there was always this thing in the back of my mind. And to this day, I mean, we're 3 or 4 years out from that decision. But what if God does give us children? Then that feels maybe like silly that I would have asked people to mourn with me, It's just, it's the maybe lies in my head, but I remember going through that thought and so thankful that we can, It was something we mourned the loss of children we had always longed for and we had pictured and we had been planning and praying for. And it was kind of something we had to mourn alone.
I think if you don't mourn that, then you never have kids and you look down the road years later and be like, we really should have, because it feels like there was no closure in that. And even if you did get pregnant, then it's like, well, that was a decision that, definitely saddened our hearts, but we had to do it. And I think that, you'd lose a lot of closure if you never mourned these things.
And I think there is that, just from my own story, maybe someone else would feel differently, but I regret not, maybe reaching out and more at, like having that mourning together. It was more like, even how I shared it with like family and friends, it was more factual because it was like,
we
not
decided
really in a place to talk about this, but this is, something that we had to decide. More cut and dry kind of conversation than.
Yeah. Were you glad that you made it's very clear that you made like a decision at a time together to stop like the treatment. But are you glad that you did that as opposed to saying, well, okay, we're just going to not do this for now, and then revisiting it 2 years later? And then like, I just feel like the way that you went about it, like it seemed like it was very like, we're going to be able to like kind of mourn for this, like, but
More
then
absolute.
but then move on and like to, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like you think is always on the table if you always have in the back of your mind, oh, in a couple of years we will revisit it. And those 2 years go by quickly. And then it's like all of a sudden you're faced with that decision again. It's hard.
Yeah. I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way, but it was intruding on our life so much. So this is now us being back at the fertility clinic, and we had an 18-month-old. And it just, it was negatively affecting everything. Like I actually had a lady from our church ask me the other day, just in passing, we were having a conversation. She's kind of picking up on some things. She said, like, are you guys not able to have any more kids? And it was one of the first times someone asked me that, and I actually could handle answering it. Right. And I said, yes. I said, if I want to sacrifice my relationship with God, my relationship with my husband, my relationship with my son, and my mental health, sure, we could probably have some more kids. But to that, I say, then that means no, we can't, because those are not things that we're willing to sacrifice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think everyone comes to that threshold at a different time. Like we took those breaks, right? Like you're saying, oh, we'll just maybe put it, for a few years. And because this journey, it was really piling on itself, because there wasn't really a break in between every little thing that we were experiencing. We just felt like there was this weight on top of us, and we needed to get out from under it.
Yeah.
So I think that's where an absolute decision was necessary for our experience.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, keep going.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, it's almost harder the second time with you, because you're going back and then you think you forgot all those mental and emotional scars that you've kind of accumulated from the first time of going to the clinic, right? And then going back, you're like, yes, this is what it's like. And all of that just gets ripped open again. And so you're already going there on a foundation that's not super healthy, right?
Yeah.
And it's harder, I think it would be.
And even one of the people that's close to me in my life that had a chance to read the book early on, they came back to me after they read it and they said, it's so interesting because to us, it was like, okay, you experienced infertility. Well, now that's done. You were put on bed rest. Well, now that's done. And they were acknowledging how, but for you, you were feeling it add on to each other. And people can't always see that, because maybe for someone else, they would be able to close that, separate them. And that wasn't something I had been able to do emotionally. So it was more, there was complexities there.
We might do that with people who are sick too, like just in the hospital. Okay, well, at least he's over that. And then, he has another thing. Well, you don't really emotionally tie it together. Just, No, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. So maybe we should touch on, we got maybe 15, 20 minutes yet.
Oh, that's all.
I know. See, it goes flies by. You think an hour and a half's long, but it's not.
I know.
I wanted to ask you about the whole postpartum phase. And I know that's like a huge thing. And like, we're really open in the book about the anxiety and the depression that went along with it. And like people can read it and they can really they get inside your brain what you were thinking. And then I appreciated that you were really open with like the faith journey part of it too. But maybe you can just speak a little bit to that and like what your experience was, and maybe like
the faith journey aspect of it.
Well, just like the postpartum side of it.
Yeah. So there is a difference between coping and surviving and like thriving. And when you're clouded with something like postpartum, you don't really realize that you might just be in a state of surviving. And I got to that point, and it took, and anyone who has experience with mental health, it takes letting other people in and what you're experiencing to find healthy coping mechanisms that allow you to thrive. And for me, it took reaching out to our pastor, because we had kind of gone through some things that I wasn't able to reconcile in my heart. Even just having him come sit with us, and, he was reminding me of, how Jesus or God sacrificed his son because he loved us so much. And as I was really struggling with the things I had to give up on our journey to have Logan and children in general, he said, how beautiful that you would be willing to give up those things for your son, those joys. And that was just like kind of breakthrough kind of moment. And it's just that wise counsel is so pivotal with postpartum because your mind is so bogged down and it's very hard to think clearly and to even process what you're going through or have gone through if you have something like postpartum. The other thing is clear communication with your spouse. Unfortunately, I've met, multiple people who like can share with the other women that they're experiencing these feelings, but don't always feel like their husband will understand.
Right.
And that team sport part of it all comes back, right? That you might not have the capacity to, the roles. There's this natural divvying up of roles that happens when you get married. It just happens. But when you're going through something like having a baby and postpartum, there's a time for those roles to shift. And I think reaching out to your spouse and communicating those things is really helpful. And 100%, even if you don't get any treatment from your doctor, letting your doctor know what's going on can be so pivotal. I know my husband got to a point where he just said to me very honestly, I don't know how to help you anymore. There was a long time where he could help me cope, and letting him know what was going on inside my mind made me feel safe. But we got to a point where neither of us felt equipped to handle it anymore. And sharing the specifics with a professional, whether you're seeking, medication or not for that's an entirely different conversation. But just having them know created safety for us because this wasn't something that was going to be going away. It was something that was persisting and getting harder and harder. And honestly, my doctor said something to me, even about taking medication for postpartum, that was so pivotal. I said, I don't want to take the medication because I don't want it to change me. And she said to me, your depression, your postpartum is creating an imbalance in your mind. And that is changing you. It's affecting your personality. When you take something like medication for your mental health, it creates a balance and then allows you to be who you already are. Right. And that was so powerful for me to be able to find the help that I needed.
Yeah. That's a great perspective way to put it. Cause it's, you think medication changes. Yeah. This is definitely for the better.
Yeah. And I think especially as like moms across the board, men, women, either way, like dads and moms, there's a new mom, check in on them, like especially if you have a relationship with them and say, hey, like, did your doctor give you any resources or education like on postpartum? Like if not, like, have something that you can send them and just say, especially if you've experienced it yourself, hey, I've gone through this. And I just want you to know you can always come talk to me. Like say it out. It's awkward sometimes because you're like, oh, like they're super joyful about their baby. I really don't want to bring down the mood because they think I'm just coming over to say hi to their little baby. But to make yourself uncomfortable for the sake of their safety, I think is pivotal.
Yeah, it's true. It's like, it's just communication across the board. But I guess unloading some of that onto professionals if it's needed, then it's like, but also having the courage as a husband to say to your wife, like, I don't know what I need to do here. And like, it not wait till the point where like, your wife's in tears to help out, like, or like to have that conversation, like just to
take the initiative and actually.
Yeah. I mean, like taking the initiative and doing things, but also taking the initiative and like in asking, like, hey, like, how are you actually like, because I mean, like you're home with a kid and it's like, I mean, most of what like, new motherhood's at home, which is something different than,
what we've done beforehand,
what you've done before, especially if it's your first kid.
So it's a new role. It's like a new job. And your body's going through healing.
And you don't get to talk to anybody other than your husband and then your baby who can't do anything.
There's an isolation that happens. Even though we're all in our homes, like in the way our community functions, a lot of us are home with our kids. We're all home, isolated to ourselves. And there's just so many ways that we can be mothering together.
But even like acknowledging the fact that men can get postpartum depression and anxiety too. And so just to check in on our husbands and ask and see how they're doing with their new role as father and provider for now, like an extra little, very dependent baby.
Yeah.
Right. And just to
There's
make sure that just
pressures
because we may be doing okay, see like if they're doing okay, because there might be some thoughts that they're having and that just need to be talked through, worked out. And just keeping that in mind too.
Was I don't know how much you want to talk about John, like your husband's story, but like, how was it like for him to leave you then with Logan and go back to work and like that whole transition too? Because that's something where like as a husband, you just don't have, you can't always be right beside your wife as she's going through all this stuff. And I mean, that's the challenge too. Like
you're talking about when we were still in the hospital?
Well, that like
when you came home,
and when you went, and when you came home,
he went
like,
back to work.
Yeah,
because I mean, you had two parts of it.
That more happened for us when Logan was still in the hospital, and it was this weird like I have to go build houses right now.
Yeah, he's like I don't want to.
Yeah, like our child's in the hospital. My wife is hanging on by a thread, if he's going to be honest.
Right.
And I'm going to go like pour some concrete today.
Nothing,
like, how does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And I think that's where knowing what resources are available to you, which we didn't with like parental leave. I know it's not as commonly used in our circles, like maternity leave is, but for the fathers to be there to support, knowing about sick leave options when your child is sick. I think knowing about those resources can be very helpful when things are feeling like there's a reason it felt like it wasn't quite right.
Right. Yeah.
Because his place was, but we didn't know how, like we had a mortgage to pay. We had, right. Like he needs to go to work.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess our community could do better. Like just to step up to like,
don't you know that this is available to you?
Yeah. Or? I mean, like even, I mean, I'm sure people, if they knew it was a struggle, would be like, you know, people would move mountains to keep him at the hospital, right?
Exactly.
But it's just something
but because it doesn't commonly happen, people don't reach out for that help. Then, oh, well, I know someone who's had a kid in the hospital. He went to work. It was fine.
Right.
And
or it's been prayed off the pulpit like 4 Sundays in a row. And you're like, well, I guess they're still there, but they must be coping because I haven't heard anything.
And you're in your own little world as well. When you're living in the hospital, especially if it's out of your own local community.
Yeah.
And you really get out of touch with reality. And you just, okay, we got through today. That's great.
Yeah.
No, there's a new day
Try
tomorrow.
Again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of what I'm saying in this book and the message that I want to share is we need to be preparing these young couples for all of this. There's no way to yourself, be ready for every little curveball that God might send you. But to hear these stories over the years and to have people share, how they can say like, God was so good to us in this, or God provided for us. Well, how did he provide? Well, he provided for me in this person. When I reached out to my doctor, he, provided for me through that person. And I was reminded of his grace through this scripture and really giving those tangible tools that were helpful on your journey. I think that is what is needed. And I think there's actually 4 parts to that preparation. I think that
Oh, that's all right.
But yeah, I think there's 4 parts to the preparation, and it starts with just seeking that understanding, actually seeking out other people's stories, especially if you're a young woman, like don't be afraid to, go to your mom and say, hey mom, like we're super excited, to have a family when we get married. Like, how was that experience for you? And maybe mom's not ready to share that story. Maybe she says, oh yeah, it was good. And you can't really push that because that's a boundary she might be setting. But then, start letting the people know in your life, like, hey, I'm ready to hear these things. But I think for you to know, hey, like my cousin just got engaged or something. And being in deep, meaningful relationship with people, not just acquaintanceships with people, and being like creating opportunities to share your story and say, hey, like, I really hope that, God gives you the desires of your heart, but this was my experience.
Right. Yeah.
So just know, like, you can always reach out to me, creating those safe spaces. And I think, being honest about what was involved in our stories, and not looking at this brokenness in the pursuit of children as the exception to the rule. I think
Right.
so often it's, well, there's normal, and then there's, oh man, like, oh, I'm glad I didn't have to
Yeah,
go through that.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But we have broken bodies in this broken world, and we're in broken relationships. Like, how can there
All
not be
steps of this journey?
how can we not have brokenness in this pursuit?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I just think we can be doing better.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we're getting pretty close to the end. I had a big question I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
While I was reading this book, I'm considering, like, especially for like newlywed couples, that the expectation that they're going to start a family. I know I wrote it down for you, and you may have a big answer for it, which is good. I'm curious that, like, I find that expectation, maybe expectation is the wrong word for this particular instance, but like the hope and the desire for the family, especially from a woman's perspective in our community, like I would say, like most women want it. And like, I find that that's like a really valuable thing in our community, because the world is saying, well, you don't need a family. You can be,
kids are a nuisance.
You can go to school. You can do whatever. You don't need kids to be fulfilled. And like, I find that that's still very well and alive in our, like, the children are so valued. Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, do you see kind of like a little bit of like a disconnect there? Like, if we, we're not discouraging people from, desiring children, but
being realistic.
But will that like realistic kind of viewpoint like discourage people from trying because they're scared of that? Or
like, my intent is definitely not to instill fear. It's to create a context and understanding. Like, God gives us our context in Genesis 3 verse 16. The woman will have pain in childbearing. That's not, hey, when you give birth, it's going to hurt.
Just every
That
aspect.
is when God says no to children, it's going to hurt. When you lose a child that you have never met, that's going to hurt. When motherhood is, not what you expected, and you're really struggling to find joy in it, that's going to hurt. And it just spans, because we're emotional, we're intellectual, we're physical people. So that pain is going to touch those areas of our life. And I think it's more the emphasis that we put on motherhood. I think, so at one time, so for myself, I'm holding many identities at one time, right? I am a white Christian woman who's married. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I'm all of these things. And God has called me to all of these things at one time. And somewhere along the way, like, the identity of mother, it is so sacred and so important and valuable. But it isn't, and there's priorities, right, of your roles. But the value and your calling to that in God's kingdom is not more valuable than the other callings that you've been given. So for the woman who doesn't have children, because they're called to something else, they're called to be a daughter, a sister, and, in their work, and all those things, those are all just as valuable as the motherhood. And I think it's this extra value that we've subconsciously, maybe even in practice, put on the motherhood. And I think maybe even just in how we speak with each other, that motherhood is this end all be all. Right. I know our pastor has an amazing sermon on this. I should have looked up what the title was. And he talks about how, motherhood isn't for the sake of motherhood, just like marriage isn't for the sake of marriage, it's for the sake of God's kingdom. Just like, so for us, it's still a challenge that we weren't able to have more children. But this calling to, find purpose and fulfillment in other areas as well as motherhood is for the sake of his kingdom, just as much as my calling is to as a mother. And I think it's that those identities all having that value in God's kingdom, and not just motherhood. I think we place that expectation on women, maybe sometimes a little too strong.
Right. Well, that's a great summary. I mean, like that. I think your book will bless a lot of people. Like, in this discussion, is something that we definitely should, should be opened up and stuff. So, maybe like share, like, if there's anything else. Otherwise, share like where people can find your book, how people can get in touch with you, because I'm sure people are like, I am struggling. Sarah, help me. Like, how can people find your book, and when's it coming out?
I just want to say, like, I'm no expert on this. This is just my experience, but I do hope that by sharing so many specifics about our story, it will encourage others to share with the people that they're close with. It's definitely not for everybody to share in the public forum, and I pray that anyone who reads it is reading it for the sake of finding understanding, that they can come alongside somebody and help them. It's not for the sake of knowing, what we've been through, because it's just one story of so many. But yeah, the book, it comes out October 9.
So this podcast might not have dropped by October 9, but
yeah, so it might be out by the time it drops.
Probably be already out.
But that's good, because then you can go and listen and then buy it.
Yeah, there you go.
Wait.
And it's on Amazon. So
Perfect.
just Google Unmet Expectations and you'll find it. And I hope it's a blessing to anyone who reads it, and helps kind of perpetuate this conversation that we were able to have.
Yeah.
And even thank you for sharing your portion of your story as well.
I feel like I've learned so much more just by hearing your experience with it too. And just I already thought I was, a little more empathetic to people, because I went through it too, but definitely.
Yeah. Definitely opens your eyes for sure.
Yeah. Way more.
It's much appreciated.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere people can get in touch with you? You on social media or something that?
Yeah. So social media, it's Echoes of My Heart. So it's at echoes.omh.
Okay. Yeah.
And otherwise you can email me at echoes.omheart@gmail.com.
There you go.
There you go.
There you have it. So check Sara out and buy her book, because it's it's something that should be read and should be talked about. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
This
I
is
really
great.
appreciate it.
I hope it was less nerve-wracking than you thought it was.
You know what? Once we started, it was great. So
it all went away.
That's
good.
You get nervous
That's good.
and then it's all good. So
and thanks, Kel, for coming on and co-hosting, because
no problem.
this is a conversation for women.
I was thankful to have another woman in the room for this conversation, even though you said Lucas didn't want to. Lucas, this is good things for you to know too.
Oh, he'll listen
you know
to
what? He would have done very well and done his absolute best.
So appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone for listening. Keep having real conversations. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. You can send us your feedback by emailing us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. You can find us on social media by looking for the handle Reformed Real Talk. You can find us online by going to realtalkpodcast.ca. We look forward to your feedback, as that's what helps us grow and improve as podcasters. Real Talk is produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, Tyler Vanderwood, and Tim Van Woudenberg. The theme music was created by Calvin Hutten. The table and cabinet behind me were made by Ethan Vanderwood of Eureka Woods. And finally, this sign in the studio was made by Zebra Signs. That's it for now, folks. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.